All right, everyone. Thank you so much for coming. Usually they send us out of the breakout room any second here. I'm planning on getting started with models first and then moving on to like the outline of the chapters, if that works for everyone. So I'll just share my screen. So we're gonna start with our male reproductive model. There are two different ones. There's this one on the green board and then one on the white board. It's the same thing for female. Maybe we don't actually have you guys, might have removed that. Anyway, female also has one on the green board, but let me check something because I don't think that that's right for it not to have the green board. Let me go check. Do you guys have any questions at all about any information about the tests? I'm just pulling this up. These are your last models, right? Because we already did kidney and brain and all of that. So this should be the only thing SI-wise that I haven't gone over in terms of models. And then we have the reproductive lectures. So Thursday session will be review, probably lab exam focused. Probably I'll go over some of the muscles Thursday. And then next week I'll review for your lecture exam. Yeah, so I'm not sure why the other link doesn't have the green model. Probably Bender doesn't plan on using the green model if you're taking Bender's class. But if you're in Knudsen's class, we should take a look at both of them, and I'll show you both. Everybody can see how there's a white board and a green board. See descending aorta and descending aorta, and then the blue in the back would be inferior vena cava. You can't really see it here. It's going to be easier for us to see it on a different angle. We're going to play around with colors here. Right now, it looks like the white is visible. So that's descending aorta. And then remember, it would split off into the iliac arteries here. So those are the iliac arteries. And that is something that could be on the test, right? It's on our key, the list of things we need to know, which you guys already, I think at this point, are really familiar with. You would be referencing this for stuff you want to know. So right there, iliac vein, iliac artery. So those are what I'm doing right now. So descending aorta, inferior vena cava would run side by side, iliac arteries, and then we have the iliac veins right next to them. The blue would be the iliac vein. Right here, you guys can see that there is the bladder. Okay, so that's the bladder, and then connecting the bladder to the kidney, right, which the kidney would be like up here, not visible, is this tube right here, which is our ureter, right? Remember, the ureter connects the kidney to the bladder, okay? And then leaving the bladder is the urethra, right, which in men comes out the penis. So what we're going to see is there's three parts of the urethra. There's the prostatic, the membranous, and then the spongy or cavernous. And you can't see those unless we pull out the bladder piece. So we'll look at those in a second. This right here, the purple, is the prostate. I'll just put PROS because there's not enough room to write prostate. So prostate right there. This would be your rectum here. Anus is the opening. Sigmoid colon is the part of the colon that's all like curvy up here. This is all stuff that could be on the test. This little fatty looking yellow thing is called the seminal vesicle. When we look at the outline in just a second, you guys are going to see what that does as part of semen production. So there's the seminal vesicle, prostate. We have the scrotum. Scrotum is the skin outside versus testy is the actual part that makes the sperm on the inside. Okay, testy, multiple testy. Yes. And then we have the prepuce, which is the same as foreskin. What people like commonly call the foreskin is the prepuce. It's the skin outside. Corona is this ring around the head of the penis, corona. Then there's the head of the penis here. Head of, and then the shaft. And then we have our epididymis above the testy, right? And that's what stores the sperm before it becomes ejaculate. So what you can see is the epididymis would get the sperm that's made in the testy, and then it's going to send it into this tube right here, which is your vas deferens, ductus deferens, or seminal duct. So it's a big deal on this lab exam that you guys know all three names. So this tube that carries the sperm up and sends it basically to be part of ejaculate. So it dispenses the sperm into the urethra during ejaculation. That tube is called the vas deferens, ductus deferens, or seminal duct, and it's carrying the sperm. Okay. So the big ones that I would say would be easy to get confused on the test is the ureter and the vas deferens. Just realize the vas deferens comes from the testy versus the ureter would connect the bladder to the kidney. So it shouldn't be easy to get them confused. It's possible you could if you kind of weren't really paying attention. And then the last thing here is this bone would be your pubic bone, right? So that's everything for this view of the model. And then what's going to happen is I'm going to take out the bladder and then I'll show you the inside. And then we'll move on to female. Any questions there? Okay. Congratulations, you guys, on almost being done. Anatomy, almost there, just a few more weeks. Less than a few more weeks. So right here, I guess today would be your finals on the 16th. So I guess you have a little more than 2 weeks. So then you take off the bladder. Oh, no, you don't. That's not taking off the bladder. Let's see if I can find one. There we go. Take off the bladder and then you see inside. So inside, let me see if I can zoom in. Get this better. Okay. All right. So zooming in, we see that there is the first, this is the bladder. This is technically called the lumen of the bladder because it's like the opening inside. This is the pubic symphysis where the two pubic bones meet. And then once again, now you get the prostate. The prostate would be the actual like part here versus the prostatic urethra is this section. So it's the part of the male urethra that's inside of the prostate. Prostatic urethra. So that's part one. Then the next part of the urethra is called the membranous urethra, and it's inside of the abdominal cavity. So do we see this little line here? That would be the end of the membranous. So this is number 2, membranous urethra, 2, membranous urethra. That's part 2. So it's from the end of the prostate to the abdominal wall is the membranous urethra. And then we have the last part of the urethra, which is the spongy or cavernous urethra, and that's the part that would fill with blood to make the penis like upright or erect, right? So 3, spongy or cavernous urethra. This would be from the abdominal wall into the tip of the penis, and then that's the one that would actually swell with blood. Okay, and then we have again, the testy and the scrotum. Oh, this is two more structures here. So you have this little side piece. I'm trying not to draw a line so you guys can see it. This little line. That is the ejaculatory duct. So the ejaculatory duct is where the vas deferens or ductus deferens will put the sperm, send the sperm, and then that will then mix with the seminal vesicle fluid, and the prostate also has some enzymes it makes. We'll look at that in a second. Anyway, so for the lab exam, you would want to know that that is called the ejaculatory duct. So on the lab exam, if it's pointing to it'll be like a piece of tape showing you the whole entire urethra section, that wants you to say prostatic urethra. Versus if it's pointing over on the right side to this ejaculatory duct, that's for ejaculatory duct. Prostate would probably be labeled for you on the outside. We wouldn't probably try to label it in here, but it is possible, and it would be labeled like on the border. Does that make sense? So just pay close attention to where stuff is pointing. And as always, if you're confused on the lab exam, ask your professor versus getting the question wrong. Last thing, I don't know if everybody's seeing it. You see this little purple dot? I think you can see it. Okay. Purple dot is called the I think I don't want to say the CalPERS, or that's it. Okay. I get the male and female one mixed up here. CalPERS or bulbourethral gland. Okay, so that's the name of that little one right there, the CalPERS gland or the bulbourethral gland. Okay, so all of that should be your list. Look at your list. The glans is the head of the penis. I think I wrote head of penis. It's supposed to be glands. Spermatic cord, I'm going to show you right now. One thing I want to show you here, I don't know why this model, remember how I said that there's two models? There's the white model and then there's the green board model. So the spermatic cord is not the same thing as the ureter. They're like on two different models. I don't know if that makes any sense, but they're on two different models. So spermatic cord is not another name for the ureter. Number 14 on one of the models is the spermatic cord. Number 14 on a different model is the ureter. Versus vas deferens, ductus deferens, seminal duct would all be names for the same thing. So I know that's a little bit confusing. Okay, but we did everything else. So let's go back here. All right, that's that. Let me erase this. And then let's look at the spermatic cord. So again, this is just more views of the same thing. Here you guys can see the inferior vena cava really well, right? I don't think I need to label it. This is a half version of a kidney. Okay, so here's the other model. There's the descending aorta. Sorry, I need to figure out how to turn off calls on my computer. Descending aorta and inferior vena cava, and then the iliac artery, iliac vein. There's the bladder, sigmoid, colon, rectum, and anus, all the same stuff we looked at before. Rotate it this way. Again, it's repeat of all the same stuff. Sigmoid, colon, rectum, anus, lumen of bladder, prostate, ejaculatory duct, prostatic urethra. So all of it's the same, but there's one thing on this model that we want you guys to look at that's specific, but it's something we want you guys to know. So you can see it on the other model. I'll show you on that one too. Do you guys see how there's the testy, epididymis, and then remember how this is supposed to be that vas deferens that brings the semen back, or the sperm back? There are blood vessels that wrap around the blood vessels wrap around the vas deferens / ductus deferens / seminal duct. So the blood vessels are called the spermatic cord. So if you see blood vessels and the question on the test will probably say name for blood vessels, that's the blood vessels and nerves are called the spermatic cord, right? Versus the epididymis versus the epididymis. The Y might be in a different spot. Versus the vas deferens. Okay, so just know that for the test. We could use this model instead. Everything should be identifiable. I'm just going to label this because it looks a little different. This is the seminal vesicle on this model. It's in the same spot, but before it kind of looked like a little fatty thing. Everything else on this model, though, should be exactly the same. You shouldn't be seeing a lot of variety. This is like the spongy or cavernous urethra. Again, it's like the same stuff. So I don't think I really need to relabel it just because I feel like if you have it on one, you have it on the other. But the spermatic cord is the one we like to test you with on this model because it's so much more obvious. If your professor just puts out the whiteboard model, like for example, maybe Bender, and Knudsen has been known to do this too. If that happens, the way we would test you on this model on the spermatic cord would be to point right here, maybe like with an arrow, and then it would just be to the blood vessels. So we would do the same thing. This would be spermatic cord, and the question would say, what is the name for the blood vessels? Does that make sense? Versus if we were asking you here, it would be vas deferens ductus deferens seminal duct. Does that make sense? Spermatic cord is the blood vessels, vas deferens is the tube. Okay, so that's everything for male. Any questions there? All right, let's do female on the model, and then we'll move on to going over the lectures. Okay, so female, again, there's two. There's the one on this whiteboard here. And then there's going to be the one on the green board. This is not on the test. We won't use this on the test. I just included it because I think it's kind of cool to see everything looking inside the pelvis. I don't know, I thought it was neat, but it won't be on the test, so don't worry about that one. Trying to see which is the best view here. Okay, so looking again, I kind of like to start, I think it's better to start with the outside. So looking at the outside, we see the descending aorta and inferior vena cava, right? Iliac artery, iliac vein. The bladder. And then it's the same thing as in males. The ureter is the tube that would connect the kidney to the bladder. Sigmoid colon. So I'm kind of starting with the stuff that's the same on both models. Sigmoid colon, this part up here. Rectum as we get closer. Anus down here. Pubic bone. And then this, you know what? I was just so focused on labeling the ureter, I labeled the bladder wrong. Sorry, I must be more tired than I think. The bladder in females is down here. This is the uterus. Ah, that was really something else. Don't accidentally do that on your test. That would be really frustrating. So bladder is down here, uterus is up here, okay? Obviously it's the uterus because it has the tubes coming off of it with the fembrae, so it's kind of like a no-duh statement. It's more like, how did I label it wrong? So the fembrae are going to be these little red finger-like structures, fembrae. Fimbriae are the red. And then the ovary is the little yellow ball below it. So there's 2 fimbriae, 2 ovary. And then we have our fallopian tube, which connects to the fimbriae here. So that's the fallopian tube, uterine tube, or oviduct. So just like the male vas deferens, ductus deferens, seminal duct, fallopian tube, uterine tube, oviduct. So you need to know all 3 names for that. Okay. Ovary, fimbriae, uterus, bladder. Okay, now let's go to, I'm going to remove this layer in the front and then we'll look inside. Okay. There's one last thing we can see pretty well from the outside. You can see the labia majora and then the labia minora. Majora are the ones that grow hair on the outside, and then minora would be the, I think the description in the text is the fleshy inner lips. And then there are the glands here, these blue, and those are called the Bartholin's glands, or greater vestibular glands. So those have 2 names. So right here, greater vestibular gland, Bartholin's, would be those blue little glands there. Okay. All right, so then moving on to the view inside of the bladder. Right here. Here's the bladder. This would be the pubic symphysis, is the blue, and then the rectum, venous, sigmoid colon, same things as before, ureter, descending aorta, all that. So this is obviously your uterus. And then in this view, now we can see the different layers of the uterus. So there, I believe they have you labeling 3 layers. Check. Looks like it's just peri and endometrium. I don't see the epi. Yeah, peri and endo. So the peri and endometrium are the 2 layers they want you to know. So endometrium would be your inner lining. Endometrium here. Inner lining of the uterus. And then the perimetrium out here. Perimetrium. Then you have the cervix right here. So that kind of like circular shape, cervix. So you could think of it as it looks kind of like a C, the letter C, cervix. Then there's the vagina here. Right, uterus is the muscle, vagina is the tube with the opening. And then the bladder, we have the urethra here. So in the past, some students on the test, I think it's just people who are going too quickly on the test and maybe don't look super closely. Like I said, sometimes your brain gets tired. Just make sure you look, because some people accidentally will say vagina for urethra, or they'll say urethra for vagina. So just make sure you don't mix those up. Just look at what's above it. You know, the big tube here with the red would obviously be the uterus, and then it's connected to that ovary over here versus the bladder and the urethra. Seems like a hard mistake to make, but I think it's easy when you get on the test and you're stressed out. There's the clitoris, and then I think that should be everything on this model except the ligaments. So there's 3 ligaments that we have you guys identify, and I'll show you those 3. So I'm just going to erase this here. And then we'll take a look at your 3 ligaments, which should be, where are we at? Making sure I didn't miss anything. Your urethral orifice is just like where the urethra goes in. So the urethral orifice would be like the entrance to the urethra right here. Does that make sense? Urethral orifice. Lumen of bladder. The difference between the bladder and the lumen of bladder is like when you see the inside, that would be the lumen. Bladder is like the outside. Don't really stress on it on the test. If on the test there was a multiple choice answer and one answer said bladder, you would choose bladder. Okay, so don't stress about that. So you choose bladder. It doesn't have to say lumen of bladder, but if it does say lumen of bladder, then that would also be correct. Okay, so I'm going to show you guys the 3 ligaments. We do like to test you guys with those, and they're visible on both models. So I'll start on this one, if I can get, this is a pretty good view here. Okay. So there's the broad ligament, and then the uterine and the ovarian. So the shiny background here is the broad ligament. It's like this shiny, pearly looking background. Then there's the uterine ligament. And the way I think about that is if this is my uterus, right? Uterus. And it's holding the uterus to the abdominal wall. So this tube right here holds the uterus to the abdominal wall. So that tube is my uterine ligament. Okay. Last tube is the ovarian ligament. It's almost impossible to see right here. I don't think you can see it at all. It's technically like right over here. It holds the ovary to the uterus, but I'm not going to label it because we can't see it. I'm going to try to show you, see if we can see it on this model. And if not, we'll have to look on the other model. But you can definitely see the broad ligament right here and the uterine ligament. Broad ligament and uterine ligament. Good? All right. So erase that. So the last ligament is that ovarian one. Like I said, I'm not sure we have a picture that shows it. Nope. I don't think we do. I think this is the only model that shows the ovarian. So on this model, picture right, whoa, sorry, I got like really close. Okay, that's good. So right here, again, this would be your broad ligament. Just because it's kind of a nice close view. This would be endometrium and periometrium. This tube here that holds the uterus to the wall is the uterine ligament. That makes sense? Remember that the fallopian tube here has 3 names. It's called the fallopian tube, the uterine tube, and the oviduct. The uterine ligament is the ligament that attaches that uterus to the front of the abdominal wall. And then you have your fembrae right here. Your ovary is the yellow again. And then here's our ovarian ligament. You guys see how there's like this little indentation here? It looks like a little tube right here. So that tube here is the ovarian ligament. Okay. Broad ligament is the shiny background. Uterine ligament is up here holding the uterus to the wall. Ovarian is basically holding the ovary to the uterus. And those are your 3 different ligaments. Okay, any questions there? Okay, I'm going to pull up notes and we're going to do the outline. Okay, so for male reproductive, the first part of the lecture kind of does some recap. Gonads are the testy, they produce sperm. Left testy is lower than right. Scrotum would be like the sac. I'm kind of glossing over that just because I feel like it's stuff that you guys would have in your notes if you've listened to the lecture. And I don't really feel like it's important to go over again. Homologous and analogous structures, again, I feel like you guys can look over that. It's not like a super important thing. So I'd rather focus on kind of the main points here. So when you're in the testy, I'm trying to draw these so that I have plenty of room to write everything else. Remember that you have, this is like a lot of recap. Some of it you'll remember and then some of it's new. Remember that inside the testy, there's the lobule. Lobules are the houses for seminiferous tubules, right? So you remember that inside of each lobule was the little seminiferous tubules that are like basically creating that sperm. So we have our little seminiferous tubule lined with little cells going through meiosis, and this seminiferous tubule has spermatogonia, and spermatogonia are specialized cells that create that go through mitosis and meiosis. So when they go through mitosis, they would duplicate more of themselves. And when they go through meiosis, they create sperm. So basically the seminiferous tubules create sperm because of spermatogonia. So here's the little sperm being created and sent into the tube. Okay, so it's a little bit of recap. If you don't remember, that's okay. But just know it will be on the test this time around too. So just kind of be reviewing that, looking at that again, so that you will not shocked when that happens. Okay, so then inside of the testy, all of those little seminiferous tubules meet up, and the spot where they meet up inside the testy is called the ret testy. Ret, R-E-T-E, testy, and this would be the meeting point for seminiferous tubules and sperm/sperm inside the testy, and then there would be one on each side, and then as that leaves the testy, it gets into the epididymis, which is the storage place for sperm outside of the testy. So this is all like definitions you would want to know for the test as well, okay? Okay, so then your epididymis is going to connect to that really special tube we talked about called the vas deferens, ductus deferens, or seminal duct. And we know that that's the one that is carrying the sperm. Okay, so that's the one that carries the sperm. Okay, so that should be pretty much all your recap. Okay, so then you have your different muscles that you guys need to know for this test. So you have two. The raphe is a little piece of tissue that separates the two sides of the scrotum. So raphe is not a muscle. Raphe is a tissue to separate the right and left sides of the scrotum, basically to keep them from, it's like a line of tissue to kind of just separate them. And then you have two different muscles. So first, what color should I do here? Let's do black. You have one muscle that pulls the scrotum together and upward. So I'm kind of drawing arrows so that it shows you what direction. So this is called the dartus muscle. So lines the scrotum to pull the testes together and up. So why is it doing this? Because sperm is heat and cold sensitive. If sperm gets too hot, and this is why the testes are located outside of the male body, if sperm get too hot, they'll die. So body temperature is too hot, so that's why they're outside of the body. And if they get too cold, right, they'll also die. So if an environment is too cold, the dartus muscle will pull the scrotum towards the body to help warm up the sperm. And then if the environment was too hot, the dartus muscle would relax so that the testes basically can get further away from body heat. Does that make sense? So dartus would contract in a cold environment, it would be contracting. So contracts with cold, right? To keep sperm alive. And then we have our muscle number 2. So I'm going to kind of draw that like this up here. Probably should have made this drawing bigger in hindsight. And this muscle is called the cremaster. So this is also a muscle. And this is attached to the floor of the scrotum. Bilaterally, so on each side, attached to the floor of the scrotum to pull testes up. So again, same thing. So when would it contract? It would contract with cold. When would it be relaxed? It would be relaxed with heat to keep the sperm from getting too hot or too cold. All right, and then your last little recap here, some of this stuff you maybe went over before, some of it you didn't. If you were in Bender's class or are in Bender's class, you probably didn't go over this before. So this is kind of a review for Knudsen students, but it could be new to you, but it's going to be on both of your finals. So, you know, be aware. So on the head of the sperm, right, because you have the head of the sperm, with chromosomes. So the head of the sperm has the actual 23 chromosomes, right? This is called the midpiece of the sperm. The midpiece of the sperm has mitochondria to basically supply the sperm with the energy it needs to move. And then lastly, the flagellum of the sperm is the part that actually moves. So this is the protein that moves to basically propel that sperm inside of the semen, right? So midpiece, flagellum, and head of the sperm are kind of the 3 parts. And then acrosome is the enzyme released to, I'm running out of room. That word is supposed to be neutralized. Let's put it here. To neutralize the corona radiata of the ovum. Okay, so when the sperm is trying to enter the egg, it will send out the acrosome in order to neutralize the corona radiata so that it can actually get into the egg. Okay. All right, so that was kind of a recap, but adding raphe, dartus, and cremaster, and then kind of a recap on other things. And then now we're going to talk more about components of semen And this is just kind of a chapter that, I don't know, we try to do, I try to just do it in a drawing. I wish that I could get it into an outline, but it doesn't really work. It just works better as a drawing. So drawing is just better, okay? So I'm going to do another drawing for this next part. So for this view, you basically have your ureters. See if I can, we're going to make the bladder really small. So this person has a very strange looking bladder. But on either side of the bladder, you guys remember that there were the little seminal vesicles, right? So this is seminal vesicle, this side, seminal vesicle. And then those are going to connect down to the next part, which is the prostate, right? So here's the prostate, okay? Remember, it has the ejaculatory duct here. And then it has prostatic urethra. So here is ejaculatory duct. This section here would be the number 1 prostatic urethra, okay? And then that will continue. See, maybe I should do blue for urethra parts. Okay, there's prostatic urethra. The seminal vesicles have ducts, and they will join up with the ejaculatory ducts. So we're going to draw a little seminal vesicle duct. They loop one on each side, and then they basically come over here. I'm just going to draw it like this. It's probably not perfectly anatomically correct, but then you guys see how they both come into the ejaculatory duct. Next up is the membranous urethra. Remember, we have our body wall. Let's make the body wall a little further out so that it looks different. So we have body wall here, right? Well, now it's going to look, okay, well, let's just make it what it is. So you have your part of the urethra that's inside of the abdominal wall, which we know is the part number 2, membranous urethra. That's inside of the abdominal wall. On either side here are the cowpers or bulbourethral glands. And then we know that we have the penis. Is what I was saying, is like, it's not really anatomically correct now because it looks funny, but we know that the part of the urethra that goes through the shaft of the penis is the 3rd part. That's really what's important. So as long as you guys get that in your notes. My pencil is not wanting to write there. There we go. Spongy or cavernous urethra is the 3rd part, okay? And then you would know that your testes would be on either side here, inside of the scrotum, okay? SD inside of the scrotum. And then what's the last thing? Oh, the last thing that we're missing is our vas deferens or ductus deferens that connects from the epididymis here, right? That vas deferens, let's do it in yellow, what color? Green. It would then come up and join up also with the ejaculatory duct. Vas deferens, ductus deferens, seminal duct. Okay, so now you have the visual and like the picture, and then what we do is we'll talk about like what actually happens on the next page, but I like to have it, I like for my notes to have a picture, and then that way it feels like I can kind of follow what's going on better. For me personally, it helps me to keep track of what's happening. Okay, so what is happening? So we'll go through each of those components, and that's the majority of the lecture. So male, honestly, and female. Reproductive is not as in depth as most of the content you've done this unit. So what did we do on the first page? This was kind of like what the anatomy of the testy and scrotum. This was kind of like testy and scrotum was the first part. So if I was doing my notes here, you could kind of do a little section if you wanted to like make an outline. You could do a section with like, what is spermatogonia? What is the seminiferous tubule, etc., right? What's the ret testi? What's the epididymis? What's the vas deferens? And then you could kind of do like, what's the sperm? So that's like an idea of how I would do an outline if you guys are kind of wanting outline help. And then now we're on to like, what is the actual process of semen creation and ejaculation? So remember, you have your urethra, and that urethra has 3 parts: prostatic, which we know is inside of the prostate, inside the prostate. The membranous, which is from the prostate to the abdominal wall. So that's the membranous urethra. And then the spongy or cavernous urethra would be from the abdominal wall through the shaft of the penis, right? Through shaft, and obviously it would end at the urethral orifice. What is the prostate gland? We're going to talk about that in a second. Okay. So then you have like our components of semen. I'm going to try to make this more organized than really the notes have it. So semen is going to be made of sperm. And we know sperm is what I already talked about, right? It has the little head, the midpiece, the flagellum, it had the acrosome. It would be made by spermatogonia, sent in seminiferous tubules to the ret testi, to the epididymis, out the vas deferens, and then that would then join up with our ejaculate. Oops. It was like random areas of my screen. Ejaculatory duct. So that's one component of semen. The other component of semen, besides just sperm, is seminal fluid. So you know how like you can get a man can get a vasectomy, right? So a vasectomy would remove the vas deferens so that they don't have any more sperm joining the semen, but they would still have ejaculate because they still have seminal fluid. That makes sense? So seminal fluid is made of 3 components. Seminal fluid comes from the seminal vesicle. Seminal vesicle, that's component 1. Okay. Seminal vesicle is located inferior to the bladder. I always write this because this is kind of the stuff that can be on the test. Inferior to the bladder and lateral. So lateral and inferior to the bladder. There are 2 seminal vesicles, and they secrete 60%. So that would be a percentage you want to know for the test. 60% of ejaculate. And it is in the form of sugar fructose, right? Because we know that sperm have to swim, and in order to swim, they require energy, and the energy comes from the fructose sugar. So the sugar fructose is the energy source for sperm movement, right? Because sperm have to move in order to reach the egg, and the egg is inside the fallopian tube. Remember, we have that long journey all the way up the vagina, right? When it's ejaculated, up the vagina, through the cervix, through the uterus, all the way out into the fallopian tube. So it's a long way that the sperm have to go, and so they require fructose the whole time. Okay, second component of seminal fluid comes from the prostate. Let's do prostate in black. So we know that the prostate is a gland. Sorry, I should have written prostate. gland. Location is, I don't know if this would be on the test like this, around the urethra when it leaves the bladder, right? So from our picture before here, our prostate is this gland and it's coming out of the bladder surrounding the urethra, right? So back over here, prostate gland, and it also secretes two things, releases, kind of running out of room, releases two things, and these are still part of the seminal fluid, which is part of the semen, right? So component A and B. So citric acid, which is an enzyme, and acid phosphatase, which is an enzyme. And both of these enzymes releases two things. So we could really just say, rewrite that, two enzymes that activate the tail, which is the flagellum, right? Tail of the sperm to move. So the energy source for the movement of the sperm comes from the fructose, which is 60% of ejaculate, which is from the two seminal vesicles, right? But the prostate gland releases two enzymes that activate the tail to move. So without the enzymes, it won't move, and without the sugar, the sperm won't move. Third component of seminal fluid, which is part of semen, comes from the Cowper's or bulbourethral gland, okay? So the Cowper's or bulbourethral gland secretes or releases alkaline fluid, okay? So the alkaline fluid neutralizes the vagina's acidity. So the vagina is naturally acidic. It's why the vagina is like self-cleaning and doesn't require like soaps to keep it clean, because it has an acidic environment. So what happens is the sperm will release this alkaline fluid to make it neutralized. Why is that? The reason is because sorry, I've lost my train of thought. It is doing that because the sperm will die in the acidic environment of the vagina. So without the Cowper's or bulbourethral gland, the sperm will die because they need the vagina to become a neutral environment. So neutralizes the vagina's acidity and the urethra's acidity. Because remember, the male urethra would still have some urine left in it because of like urination through that same urethra, and the urine is acidic. So it neutralizes the vagina's acidity and the urethra's acidity. This is called pre-ejaculate. So pre-ejaculate is released usually like a few seconds to a few minutes prior to actual ejaculate, neutralizing that acidity in order for the sperm to then follow and be in a neutral environment. So that's the pre-ejaculate, okay? So 3 parts to seminal fluid: pre-ejaculate, the 2 enzymes from the prostate gland, and then the seminal vesicle fluid, all combining to make semen when combined with sperm, right? Sperm being made by the spermatogonia, released into the seminiferous tubule, to the ret testi, to the epididymis, to the vas deferens, which connects to the ejaculatory duct. So the ejaculatory duct, I feel like this is a good little spot to put it, because it has a little definition too. So the ejaculatory duct is going to combine the seminal vesicle ducts. So when the seminal vesicles release their product, which we know is now the fructose, so it combines one seminal vesicle duct, will combine with the vas deferens, ductus deferens, or seminal duct, and we know that that has the sperm, right? So there's the sperm connecting into the ejaculatory duct. So those 2 components to make up the ejaculatory duct. So if your wheels are turning and you're kind of like, okay, well, we know that the semen is made of sperm, and sperm comes from or is sent via the vas deferens, right? So there's my sperm and my seminal vesicle duct fluid going into that ejaculatory duct. What about the prostate and cowpers? Let's go back here. So if the ejaculatory duct is getting vas deferens, ductus deferens, seminal duct, and the seminal vesicle duct together, that's what comes into the ejaculatory duct, it's going to feed that into the actual urethra, right? The prostatic urethra has the components of the prostate, which is the two enzymes, and that Cowper's or bulbourethral gland will send its products right here. So the actual ejaculatory duct only needs to receive from seminal vesicle duct and vas deferens, because the prostate will release its products directly into prostatic urethra, and the Cowper's directly into the urethra as well. Okay, so that's why that's that way. Okay, any questions there? So it should be mostly here on this outline, kind of showing you what's the urethra components, what's the semen, and then what is actually in the testy, how that is creating the sperm. We're going to talk about a few more terms. I'll talk about hernias real quick, and then testosterone creation, and then that it's like 5 terms, and we'll be done with male, and we'll move on to female. So we will get through both of them, probably still finishing before 6:45, like maybe even 6:30. Okay, so that was like the outline of kind of the bulk of the information for male. If I do a new page and then I say, you know, this would be like, I don't know, additional stuff that could happen with male. Let's try to do it in an outline because I feel like it's nice. So this is the topic of hernias. Hernias are when abdominal contents leave. So they're leaving the abdomen, leave out the abdominal cavity. So that's a hernia. There are 3 places. Okay, you have your inguinal hernia, the abdominal hernia, and then the hiatal hernia. Inguinal hernia is when that those abdominal contents go through the tube where the vas deferens leaves the scrotum, which is called the inguinal canal. So abdominal contents leave the inguinal canal, and the inguinal canal is also where, probably shouldn't have put is, also where the vas deferens leaves the scrotum. So it's kind of trying to say, basically it will bulge out into the testes, and you'll basically have abdominal contents trying to bulge out into the testes because there's like a weak spot. Does that make sense? Hernias happen in a weak spot. An abdominal hernia can happen anywhere in the abdomen. This is what most of us have heard of. This is usually at the belly button. So it's like a weakened area where all these, you know, for a baby, it used to have the source of a nutrient source, right? Like blood used to supply. So this would be usually abdominal, coming from a belly button, could be other areas of the abdomen. And then lastly is the hiatal. This is through the diaphragm. So this one is like really potentially serious. This could cause someone to not being able to breathe anymore because it like presses against the lungs. So it's not common, but this is through the hole for the inferior vena cava and descending aorta. Remember how I showed you, right? The inferior vena cava and descending aorta, they come through the top. So the hiatal is when the abdominal contents would push through that hole where the inferior vena cava and descending aorta enter into the abdomen. So that's hernias. Just know, you know, what I just wrote would be sufficient to know. We know, I already labeled, I don't think I should write this because I think you guys would know this from what I labeled on the model, right? Prepuce is the same as the foreskin of the penis. Glans is the same as the head of the penis. Corona is that ring around the penis, but it's, so the corona is where the shaft and the glans, this is the head, meet, right? So that's the corona, it's like a ring. Prepuce is the same as the foreskin. Circumcision would be the removal of the foreskin, removal of the prepuce. Removal of prepuce. Okay. Vasectomy, we already kind of talked about this. A vasectomy removes, or it doesn't remove, it ties off. Yeah, it ties the vas deferens so that they cannot supply. So sperm supply is cut off. So ejaculation would still happen because we know that the majority of ejaculation is coming from the seminal fluid. So a person who had a vasectomy would still have ejaculation in the form of a seminal fluid, just no sperm because the vas deferens section is cut off. So vasectomy is when that supply is cut off. They still produce testosterone. So testosterone production doesn't stop if someone has a vasectomy. And the reason is testosterone production is governed by interstitial cells. These are called cells of Leydig. Cells of Leydig produce testosterone. They are produced inside the testy, right? So if the vas deferens is just a tube, we would know that that would mean that you would still have testosterone if you had a vasectomy, right? So cells of Leydig produce testosterone. That could be on your test. Cryptorchidism. It's doing that thing. Cryptorchidism. Cryptorchidism, this is when the testes fail to descend into the scrotum and they remain in the abdominal cavity. So this is usually in someone who's, you know, reaching adolescence and their testes haven't descended yet. And then they may have to go in and consult with a doctor, you know, if they've had failure of their testes to descend. As we already said, erection would be the filling of the cavernous or spongy urethra with blood. So I'm not going to rewrite that. Okay, so that's everything for male reproductive. Okay, so not super, super long. So female reproductive system. Some of the same things that I said before. The gonads would be the ovaries. Female hormones are estrogen and progesterone. Okay, do a quick function of each one. So estrogen governs the secondary sexual characteristics. So in women, this would be things like breast development, the distribution of body hair. Those are all secondary sex characteristics. What are the things that make someone a female besides their, you know, their uterus, right? Everything else. Breast development, no facial hair, hair pattern development, all of that. So that's governed by estrogen. It also helps the follicle grow with meiosis 1 and meiosis 2. Okay, so it helps the follicle grow with meiosis 1 and 2. and it basically works with FSH, FSH being follicle stimulating hormone. Okay. And then we have progesterone, which is the other female hormone. It is going to help build up the endometrium. So the goal of progesterone, you can think of progesterone as being pro-pregnancy. So it helps the female body to be healthy enough to be able to have or maintain a pregnancy. So helps to build up the endometrium to maintain a pregnancy. If no fertilization occurs, progesterone drops and the endometrium sheds. And when the endometrium sheds, this would be menstruation. Okay, so a period, bleeding, right? So that happens without fertilization. We know that the ova is the same as the sex cell, and oogenesis is the creation of the ova. Okay, so that would be hormones here. Okay, next section is we have the external female anatomy, and then we'll talk about the internal female anatomy. Internal. And as usual, we'll see how much I can write on this page before I run out. So there is the labia majora, which are the rounded, fat-filled pubic hair labia. So we know that those would be the external, they would be more external. Labia minora. So majora, just think like major, like bigger, minora, minor, smaller. These would be internal to the majora. These have no pubic hair. And they will, inside of the labia majora, there are the greater vestibular or Bartholin's glands would be found like inside of the labia majora, and those are releasing lubrication when the labia minora fill with blood during arousal, right? So you have sexual arousal, the labia majora get large, and then what happens is the greater vestibular or Bartholin's gland are going to release lubricant mucus type of fluid. Okay, so that's labia majora, labia minora. There is the mons pubis. Mons pubis is the fatty tissue that sits over the pubic bone. So this is like what you would usually see on a female, that's like has the pubic hair. It's kind of like it's a fatty filled area. Fatty tissue that sits over the pubic bone has pubic hair. That's called the mons pubis. There is the clitoris, or is the clitoris and the prepuce. So the clitoris, we know that would be equivalent to the glans penis, homologous to the glans penis. And then there's the prepuce, which there's actually a foreskin over. This is a foreskin of the clitoris. So when the clitoris becomes erect, the prepuce would retract just like in males. And then we have trying to figure out if there's something I'm missing. No, that's a secondary thing. So together, all of these would make up what's called the vulva. or the pudendum. So externally, everything that I just wrote is called the vulva or pudendum. So the vulva or pudendum are the external female sex characteristics. So everything that's on the external part. Good? That would be the vulva or the pudendum. So sub-bullet points would be each of these. Does that make sense to everybody? Each of those are a part of the vulva or the pudendum. So it's accurate anatomically to refer to a woman's outside components as vulva, right? Not vagina, because vagina is an internal characteristic, which we'll talk about in a second. Okay. All right, so now internally, what do we look at? So we know that internally we have the uterus. This is where I'm probably going to run out of room here, but we'll see what we can fit. So the uterus is an internal structure, and the uterus has 3 parts. There is the fundus. I'm going to write this. I'm going to draw this on the next page. Fundus, the body, and then the cervix. Cervix is the opening into the uterus. Body is the main area of the uterus. And then fundus is the area above fallopian tube entrance. Okay. And then we have our fallopian tube. And then that's going to have 3 parts. And that's going to be the infundibulum, the ampulla, and the isthmus. Okay, so moving on, and just a little note here, we don't have too much longer, so hang with me if you guys can. This is like a little bit of a slow part, and then we'll be done pretty shortly here. So, and then that'll be the last of new content, and then we'll just be doing review in future sessions. Okay, so we have our 3 components of the uterus. So the fundus is right here. Like I said, fundus is above where the FT, I'm going to say FT for fallopian tube, where the fallopian tubes enter. Okay, body would be kind of like your main portion of the uterus here. And then we know cervix is our entrance to the uterus. So we have the fallopian tube, also called the oviduct. I knew I was getting something in there. Uterine tube and oviduct. And then connected here is my ovary, okay? 1 on each side. And we know that the fimbriae are at the end here of my fallopian tube. So let's draw my ovary a little closer. There we go. Okay. Infundibulum is going to be the first part of the fallopian tube right here. So this is part number 1. Infundibulum. So this receives the egg first after ovulation. So you guys remember when you ovulate an egg, you ovulate it into the abdominal cavity, and then the fimbriae pick it up, and because of cilia on the fingers of the fimbriae, they're going to pull it in, and then it will get inside the actual fallopian tube. So the ovary and the fallopian tube are not connected directly. The fimbriae have to use cilia to bring that egg inside. Then we have the second part of the fallopian tube, the ampulla. The ampulla is where fertilization normally occurs. So that would be a good thing to know, for your test. Ampulla, where fertilization, and remember, fertilization is the meeting of that egg with that sperm. So when ejaculate would come in, the sperm would be swimming all the way up on their way to the ampulla to try to meet up with an egg. And then our last section of the fallopian tube is called the isthmus. And the isthmus enters or flares into the uterus, right? It's entering or it's flaring into the uterus. Body is the main portion, cervix is the opening, okay? And you guys remember that, you know, when basically you have that ejaculate, it would come in. Then we have our, I think I have it in that picture, our 3 layers. You have your perimetrium and endometrium. How do you spell number 3? ISTHMUS. I don't know why I'm missing. Sorry, give me 1 second. I thought that I had. Endometrium is basically going to be like this, like we've talked about already. It's going to be the part that gets shed here. This would be your endometrium, and that's the part that will drop or get shed. So this is your part of the uterine layers. So there are 3 uterine layers. This is the 3rd layer. Part of the uterine layers that is shed or proliferates each month when progesterone falls with unsuccessful fertilization, right? If you have fertilization or sperm meeting the egg, the endometrium will not shed. The endometrium will not shed. You won't have a period. If you have overgrowth of the endometrium layer, you could kind of, Knudsen uses the term cancer, which is overgrowth of a tissue. This is called endometriosis. Endometriosis, though, is not cancer. So if you ever hear of somebody that has endometriosis, it's not cancer. I think he's using the word cancer to describe endometriosis, because what happens to somebody with endometriosis is they get endometrium growing in their abdominal cavity. So what will happen is they'll have a lot of pain, usually very heavy periods, because it's like an overgrowth of this endometrium is kind of everywhere. Does that make sense? So endometriosis is not cancer, but it is an excessive overgrowth of the endometrium. All right, the next layer of the uterus is our muscle layer. So this is going to help with propelling out the endometrium. It will help with birth as well. So myometrium, myo meaning muscle. This is layer number 2 of the uterus, and this is the muscle middle layer. So these are the 3 layers of the uterus. And then the last one, I'm going to try to not mess up my drawing too much here. Perimetrium. Perimetrium is going to be your outside layer. So these would be your 3 uterine layers. 1, 2, and 3. So putting them back on this outline, we know that the uterus, should probably use the same color. Uterus, in addition to having 3 parts, the uterus would have 3 layers: perimetrium, myometrium, and endometrium. So that's kind of how I would do my outline on that. I would add that there. You also have fembrae. You could add that here. Fembrae, finger-like extensions of the fallopian tube, which you guys already have learned about previously, right? Okay, so let's talk about our ligaments. I'm just looking here. So ovulation, I'm going to do like this is like a little recap. Ovulation, egg leaves the ovary. Step number 1. Step number 2, fembrae, finger-like extensions of the fallopian tube with cilia pick up the egg. Sorry, someone wanted me to go back. I think here is where you wanted me to go back. So ovulation is our first step. The fembrae are going to pick it up. And then after the fembrae pick it up, we're going to get it into step 3 would be the infundibulum. So it's going to get inside the fallopian tube, first into the infundibulum, then into the ampulla, then into the isthmus. Hopefully fertilization takes place. If fertilization, implantation of the zygote, this is kind of like a recap for you guys. Implantation of the zygote happens into the endometrium. So the endometrium is built up in order to sustain a growing baby. So implantation of the zygote happens into the endometrium. If no fertilization, the endometrium sheds as a period. Sheds as a period. Okay. This would also coincide with a fall of progesterone. And then ovulation is the rise of estrogen. So estrogen builds up the egg while it's still inside the follicle, more and more and more until finally we get ovulation. And then at the same time, progesterone is building up that lining to hopefully sustain the implanted egg. And then if there is no fertilization, then you'll have a fall of progesterone, which leads to the expelling of the endometrium. Okay, so hopefully that was a good little mini recap there. So for the ligaments, for female ligaments, there are going to be 5. I have a little picture that I drew that I felt like helped me. So if you picture, here's an ovary and an ovary. This is kind of like the uterus viewed from the top. Here's the uterus with the fallopian tube and the fembrae. So kind of from the top, you have your broad ligament, uterine. So again, I'm going to write down the definitions real quick, but I'm just doing this so hopefully you guys can feel like you can visualize it. Color them in to make these guys more visible. Ovarian, suspensory. So this isn't like, Knudsen didn't draw this. It's not in your book. I just made this up because I was having a hard time with these when I was taking the class. Suspensory, and then round. Okay, so there's round. Sorry, I didn't do it quite right there. Round. Yes, okay, so I'll do round first. So the round ligament is going to hold the ovary to, I don't know why it's doing that to me, to the broad ligament. So you can see that how I drew it, right? Round holding the ovary to the broad. Broad ligament is going to hold all other ligaments together. Okay, then you have your ovarian. Ovarian ligament holds the ovary to the uterus. The, what color did I do? Uterine ligament holds the uterus to the body cavity, to the body. That would be like your, you know, the back of your abdominal wall to the body cavity. And then lastly, the suspensory ligament, suspensory, that would hold the ovary to the body wall. Okay. So again, those would be 5 ligaments you would want to know. The picture just was something I made up to help me. It's not You know, if the picture is confusing to you, then you don't need to know the picture. It's just something I made up to help me. Okay, so now we're going to go through some things that can go wrong in the female. And then I'm going to go back to this picture though right here because I have one little thing here. So we know that this would be the vagina. Okay. The entrance into the vagina, entrance of vagina, is called the vestibule. So the vestibule you could put on the external female anatomy because technically it's visible from the outside. So the vestibule. And then we have the hymen. And the hymen is what helps keep the vagina sterile. Typically, this would break in girls when they're exercising. As a little girl, it's not something that, you know, sometimes the first time someone has sex is what breaks the hymen, but sometimes it's just riding a bike or using a tampon. Okay, so it does help keep the vagina sterile, but at the same time, we already said the vagina is acidic, so it's like it's kind of already self-cleaning. So it doesn't need the hymen, but now you know what the hymen is in case it was on the test. Okay? All right, so hymen and vestibule both could be on the test. If you get a pregnancy that is outside of the endometrium, so it's not attaching correctly to the endometrium, and it is not developing in the uterus, it's called, I'm going to try to attach like different terms here. So it's called an ectopic pregnancy. It's a pregnancy outside of the uterus, right? So that's our goal of where we want the pregnancy to develop is inside the uterus. So, you know, when I was taking, it was actually funny, last semester we were in nursing school, right? And I'm realizing for the first time, okay, so the uterus literally expands to be the entire size of a baby. And I was like, kind of sad that somehow I took anatomy and didn't realize that. So just in case you guys didn't realize, what's actually expanding to fit the size of a baby is the uterus normally. Now, an ectopic pregnancy is, for example, like right over here inside this fallopian tube. Now, if that's the case, the fallopian tube cannot expand. So this is potentially fatal. An ectopic pregnancy can kill the mother and the pregnancy. So the mother and the baby can both die. So in an ectopic pregnancy, usually an ectopic pregnancy is a tubal pregnancy. So I don't know exact percentages, but I would think, you know, over 90% of the time an ectopic pregnancy is a tubal pregnancy. So this means that it's implanted inside of the fallopian tube. Sometimes this would happen if fertilization happened too soon. So maybe if it got fertilized in a different spot. But as far as the test goes, just know an ectopic pregnancy outside the uterus, usually probably would be a tubal pregnancy, which is when, again, it would be implanted in the tube. If for some reason you had a pregnancy where the baby is developing right here at the entrance to the cervix, that is called a placenta, can lead to a condition called placenta previa. Placenta previa is when, so zygote lands on the cervix, causes bleeding, and can you guys see that? Causes bleeding and possible pregnancy loss because basically the cervix is not strong enough to maybe hold that whole entire pregnancy. Sometimes people can be successful and have a placenta previa. Usually this would be with like exercise limitations. You know, this is somebody who's not going to be able to have sex while they're pregnant, vaginal penetrative sex while they're pregnant, because that's going to be penetrating or tapping against the cervix, which could cause the pregnancy to be lost. Does that make sense? So somebody who has placenta previa can have a successful pregnancy, but they need to take precautions because the baby is basically growing on the cervix. Well, not on it, but near it. Hysterectomy would remove The fallopian tubes, sometimes this can remove part, which is called a partial hysterectomy, or the fallopian tubes, the ovary, the uterus, which is a total hysterectomy. I guess I will make a page for this. I was trying to figure out if I should or not. So total hysterectomy would be the removal of all, like, the female. So this would be fallopian tubes, uterus, and the ovaries. Someone can have a partial hysterectomy. So there are different types of partial. Someone can remove the uterus, can remove the ovaries. Usually partial hysterectomies involve, like, tying the fallopian tubes. So kind of like a vasectomy, a partial hysterectomy would tie the fallopian tube so you don't get the egg traveling, and so, you know, someone can't get pregnant in that case. Artificial insemination, right? This would be when you have a sperm donor, semen donor. There can be homologous. I'm just going to be honest, this is like, this little topic right here is very unlikely to be on the test, but I'm going to write it real quick. Homologous is when the parents donate. So it's like the actual, they would donate their sperm and their egg. And then heterologous would be there are donors. So, you know, the actual mother is maybe carrying the child and then they couldn't conceive, so they fertilize it outside and implant it. That'd be when the parents donate. So this is like fertilized outside. And this is, again, the parents. Versus donors could be maybe a donor sperm, a donor egg, and that would be heterologous. I don't really want you guys to stress on that because, like I said, it's pretty unlikely you'll see that. Last thing, mammary glands. So mammary glands are located inside of the breast, inside the breast. The mammary glands or the breast, sorry, I just realized I said this wrong. Mammary glands are the same thing as the breast. Obviously, this would be not something necessary to have children. You can have breast cancer, have your breasts removed, and still have children. The mammary gland or the breast has inside of it lactiferous glands. Lactiferous glands produce milk, each having a duct with a nipple, with a duct leading to the nipple. There we go. Duct leading to the nipple. So the lactiferous glands are what are actually producing the milk. So when a person has a child, they're going to develop more lactiferous glands to have more milk production, right? Fat is in between each of the lactiferous glands. And we would know that they're not, again, mammary glands or breasts are not a part of reproduction, not necessary for reproduction. Okay, they're just part of nourishing or feeding the baby. Okay, so that's it for reproductive. I was trying to leave a few minutes here for questions or going back to screens. I'll go back. There's ligaments. Here's the drawing of female. Overview or outline. Male, we had this one to begin. This was our next one. And then we talked about what each of those were. And then some kind of bonus terms. And there's our last one we ended on. I will see you guys Thursday for a review of lab exam. I'm planning on kind of just doing muscles and maybe some models. If you guys need any help with anything, please come like with notes so that I can guide or help as much as possible. And that will be it. And then next week will be our last week. So thank you guys so much. If you need to go, you can go. And then of course I'll be here for the next 10 minutes.
I have a question.
Yeah.
So in the lecture, Dr. Knudsen went over like the homologous versus heterologous. Like I felt like he made it like kind of a big deal, but I didn't really understand exactly what he was saying because he talked more about like the structure, or is that what it was? The structures, or I can't remember what he said. Hold on, let me get my notes. And then he said, but this is about like chromosomes or something. So I'm just confused what exactly we need to know for the test.
You know, it's a great question. I'm trying to like figure out how to answer you. I don't remember every question on my exam, and I try to be true to like the course by not, I don't like to look at all the exams because then I know that I'll be more tempted to tell you guys exactly what's on there. So I don't, but I just try to remember what was on the exams I took so I can be as honest as possible, if that makes sense. I don't remember whether or not there were questions on that. So I can tell you that it's not going to be a significant topic on the test. So what I will say is like the basics of homologous and heterologous. You can think of like the word homosexual and heterosexual. Heterosexual likes the opposite sex. Homosexual would like the same sex, right? So homologous structures would be the same male and female. So an example is the clitoris and the head of the penis. So it's like, even though it's not the same thing, it's equivalent, right? Like labia majora is equivalent to the scrotum, homologous structures. Mm-hmm. Heterologous structures is like, they could maybe serve the same function, but not be, you know, in any way like the same thing. So I don't know. I think he gave some examples of that. I can't think of one.
I understood that part of it. I got confused when he switched it to being about genes. And then I was like, okay, wait, what do I need to know about that? Because that part threw me off. Like I understood the first part where he was talking about it as like structures, but then when he was talking about it as genes, I got confused.
So with chromosomes, every human has 23 pairs of chromosomes, which equals 46 altogether. 22 pairs out of the 23 pairs are the same no matter what human you look at. The 23rd pair changes. So in females, 23 pairs are identical. So both sides of the pair are identical from pair 1 all the way to pair 23. For males, the first 22 are identical or homologous, and the last pair is heterologous or different, and that's the XY. So like the 23rd, this is the other way you could say it. 23rd pair, if you're in females, is going to be X, and that's homologous. 23rd pair. Now, mind you, the 22 pairs are always homologous. So they're always the same, male or female. In males, X, Y, X, and then a little Y, these would be heterologous for the 23rd pair.
Okay, thank you. That makes sense.
So that should be everything you need on that.
Okay, and then I just had a question about, I guess it's not really, I got kind of confused last week when you were talking about the lecture exam, and I felt like you were saying like not to stress too much or not to go into like too much detail, but now I feel like if I do that, I'm not going to go into enough detail. So I just don't know, especially with the senses lecture. That's the one that I feel
just depends on how your study habits. I don't know how to, I don't want to say this in a bad way. What your previous grades and your previous study habits have been is kind of how you should take that advice. When I was taking this class, I was I was spending so much time trying to figure out the details of the brain lecture that I could have just focused on the overview more and been okay. But instead I was like majorly stressing myself out trying to figure out every detail. That's kind of, I'm trying to like hopefully encourage some people that are really feeling stressed out about every detail. But you know, you've taken the previous 2 exams, you know that you can't be like not knowing the details. I mean, it's like, but I guess it's like, you know, it's like you have to figure out, you can ignore the advice too. If you've been successful using your own study habits, better to study too much than not enough. But if you're like stressing out and feeling like, okay, I need to learn every single sentence of every single thing, I'm just not getting it, try to back up and focus on the overview. Make sure you have the bullet points and the key points, because there's going to be a lot more of like, okay, for senses, for example. Which of these is the dendrite? Which of these is connected to the nerve? Which of these is, the sensation for the vestibule? What is the vestibule a part of? Is it a part of the inner ear, the middle ear, or the outer ear? What is the other name for the vestibule? The otolith organ, right? So if you're like spending all your time trying to figure out the process, you might not study enough the simple things, which still take time to learn, but the simple things like the other name for vestibule is otolith organ. The vestibule is part of the inner ear. And you may lose some of that if you're out here like, okay, well, I need to know everything about the process. I need to know all this. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it does. Yeah. Okay. Because that's kind of how I felt. Okay.
Like still know the process. You should get the idea of like the vestibule, there's the utricle, there's the saccule, the kinocilium and the stereocilia together with the calcium carbonate with the stereocilia depolarize the kinocilium. That would be it, right? Because it's the calcium carbonate, stereocilia, depolarize the kinocilium. Kinocilium is the dendrite. Like you have everything you need right there. That would be all the stuff you need. So sometimes with me, I noticed that I was getting so focused on these little tiny details. I did good on the exam, but I'm saying looking back, I could have just focused more on the bigger points and not stressed so much. But I don't want you to under stress and then be upset with your score either. So I'm trying to like.
Yeah, no, I get it. Yeah. I just, when I rewatch the lecture or when I re-listen to some of the lectures, I hear things and and I feel like I understand a lot of it. And then I'll hear something and I'm like, oh, I don't remember that part, but it doesn't really seem like it's super relevant. So I don't know.
I would not be stressing on one sentence that you didn't hear this time around for this test. This test is less detailed than the previous two tests.
Okay.
If somebody is out here and they got, 52s on test 1 and 2, no, obviously I'm not trying to be mean. I'm just saying you would need to change something in your studying for test 1 and 2. You're not going to be doing well on test 3. But if you did really well on test 1 and 2, your level of detail you studied on those two, it's not going to be as extremely detailed.
Okay.
But
Thank you.
You still have a lot on there. It's like, there's a lot to know. So it's like, you can't not study, obviously.
Okay. Thank you.
Yeah. Hopefully it's encouraging and it helps you kind of focus better. All